Thank you very much, Jonathan. And welcome everybody. Yeah, we've got a session now which is focusing on health effects as they intersect with drug production and drug use in settings affected by conflict. The London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine has been working with the Drugs and Disorder Project, SOAS and others. And we're going to touch now on a few of the studies we've been doing as part of the GCRF project in collaboration with Colombia National University, as well as the Asian Harm Reduction Network in Myanmar. I guess an overarching kind of framework for the health effects work that London School's been doing with those people I just mentioned is ideas of risk environment. The idea is that health effects related to drug use are in some way mediated by the environments in which people are living and working and so on. And the studies we've been doing in different ways, I think, trace the effects of risk environments in relation to health effects related to drugs. So some of the work we're going to focus on is going to look at issues of drug use as it relates to health effects. The Myanmar work does that, and some of it's going to focus on issues of drug production and how drug-related health harms fold into drug productions, and the Colombia work does that. So with us, we have myself. I'm based at the London School. My background's in sociology. We have Bayard Roberts, who's going to be talking to you about some survey work in Myanmar, along with Khine from the Asian Harm Reduction Network. Linda, who's with us from Colombia, welcome everybody, and Magdalena Harris, who works with Bayard and myself at the London School. So these are the people you're going to hear from in the next hour or so. I think we should get going. We're going to start with the focus on Colombia, and we have two presentations for you. The first is by Magdalena, and she's going to set out some of the framing, if you like, which sits behind the work we've been doing in Colombia, which investigates chemical harms related to drug production processes in coca's cultivation. So Magdalena is going to set the scene for us with a little bit of a literature review, and then we're going to hear from Linda, who's going to focus more specifically on some of the ethnographic work that she and we have been doing in Colombia. So Magdalena, if I could pass things over to you now. Thanks very much.
Cool. Thank you, Tim. So as Tim said, I'm going to introduce our study in Colombia. And this is called Following the Chemicals, a qualitative exploration of chemical health effects of coca cultivation and paste production. So next slide, please. So we can think of the conflict situation in Colombia in relation to drugs as one characterized by chemical warfare, whereby, I mean, most of you have probably heard about the issues of glyphosate fumigation. So from 1994 to 2015, militarized aerial fumigation with glyphosate has been core to the United States Colombia anti-drug policy, or Plan Colombia. Now, harms from glyphosate fumigation to human health, particularly in relation to miscarriage, also to licit crops as well as illicit crops, livestock and ecology have been well documented. And, and the potential resumption of aerial fumigation of glyphosate poses a continued threat to local health and livelihoods. This is evidenced as a matter of international concern. And we know a little bit about cocaleros, or cocoa growing communities' resistance to this interdiction, to this militarized fumigation in relation to protecting plants, but also disruptive social mobilizations in fighting ground eradication. But what we don't know about actually is the use of chemicals beyond glyphosate and the actions that cocoa growers and their communities take to protect their health in the face of fumigation, or the other ways in which anti-drug policy informs chemical use and toxicity in everyday cocoa cultivation and production processes. Next slide, please. So this is really what our study is focusing on. We're wanting to look beyond glyphosate. We're focusing primarily on cocoa cultivation and production. And turning to the literature, what is interesting We get an indication, as you can see through this extract, of some of the chemicals that may be used and their potential for human health harms. So this extract here from the literature is quite typical, really. It says, in the process of maceration and washing cocoa leaf to make cocoa paste, processors indiscriminately discard enormous amounts of gasoline, kerosene, sulfuric acid, ammonia, sodium carbonate, potassium carbonate, and lime onto the ground into nearby waterways. Now, what's interesting about this excerpt is that cocoa farmers and paste producers are invariably positioned as perpetrators of ecological harm. There's little critical attention to the political and social relations that inform the use of specific chemicals, the ways they're employed, and the means at their disposal. This is if people have agency to enact safer means of disposal, for example, whereas the way that chemicals are being disposed is very much informed by prohibitive drug policy. So, and there's been very little discussion or evidence of work with cocoa growing communities in these literatures, and which is going to inform the types of knowledge that are produced and the understandings of harm. So we're interested in rectifying that by working with local communities and asking them how they experience, understand, and protect against health harms arising from use or exposure to chemicals in cocoa cultivation and paste production processes. But also wanting to look at, what are the generative possibilities that borderland cocoa ecologies afford in protecting against chemical-related harms? How does interdiction, the war against drugs, impact the types of chemicals used, their modes and locations of use, storage and disposal? And how in practice can we best work with cocoa growing communities to help reduce their risk of chemical health harms? And what can we learn from local harm reduction strategies currently employed? Next slide, please. So here we're wanting to extend the conversation, both in relation to understanding of what harm reduction is and what it's primarily interested in, but also from a focus around harm to around small practices of care and what we can learn from this. So if we think of harm reduction policy and research, it's typically focused on attending to the impacts of illicit drug consumption. And here we are interested in thinking about illicit drug production and how risk environments of prohibition can impact this. And, we contend that the livelihoods that cocoa affords are bound within broader political, economic context of precarity and conflict. And so we're interested in this in terms of thinking about how exclusion and dislocation can coexist with creativity and resistance. And so our focus is not only on harm, but on how small acts of care and protection are capacitated within these contexts of constraint. And we're interested also in attending to how harm reduction can be thought of more broadly in an ecological approach, and how the interactions of chemicals with their environment and in terms of reducing harm from working with chemicals it's not only about bringing in external resources, but adapting with and living with the environment. And this article in the International Journal of Drug Policy extends upon that. Next slide, please. Okay, so why is this important? Why we know the harms of glyphosate? Why are we turning our attention to the chemicals that people are using themselves in production and paste, cocoa cultivation and paste production? The reason for this is, if you look at the literature, there are indications of harm. It's not really talked about in that way that often, though. So there is evidence used of banned organochloride pesticides such as hepatochlora, which is associated with breast cancer risk. There are reasons these pesticides have been banned, but they may still be of use in Colombia. And there's been very little work done on this. An interesting study that was based in Ecuador, Hertek et al. Explored pesticide knowledge and practice amongst farmers who are growing illicit crops. And nearly half reported adverse health effects, dizziness, etc. Nearly 70% reported direct skin contact, and only 12% used protective clothing. And there's been no work in this context, to our knowledge, in the Colombian situation and in a context of illegality. Next slide, please. In relation to cocoa-based production, we can see that the literature primarily details the chemical steps of production rather than the logistics of purchase, storing, handling, application, disposal. It doesn't look at the social relations of use. It's technical, and to sort of find out about what the chemicals are and how they might be used, you have to sort of wade through or go to diverse literatures. But we can see that sulfuric acid is commonly used, kerosene as well, and these are both associated with adverse health effects. There's also little information available on the environments in which production takes place or the actors involved in the process. And this is important because if you think in terms of an occupational health and safety response, are the labs in which cocoa paste production takes place, is there ventilation? Do people wear masks? Do they wear, and possibly not, particularly in context of criminalisation and a need for secrecy, a need to use available resources, etc. So, again, we believe that this is important. It's an important thing to explore. There's small indications from small literature of chemical burns. This from Peru, where they say drug traffickers often employ local people, including children, to trample the leaves on the processing pits. The acidic solution can burn the feet of labourers. I think we also want to refute some of the narratives that are going on there about drug traffickers employing local people. This is a local industry that is productive and capacitating in terms of enabling care and protection and the buying of resources as well. So we're very much wanting to understand from the local cocaleros perspective around what chemicals mean to them, rather than just going in and saying these are bad, but how may we capacitate use more safely. Next slide, please. And so Linda's going to talk much more about the findings and about some of the methods employed in this study, but just briefly, we can think of this as a rapid ethnography that took place in, 1 minute warning, okay, took place in Porto Assis, and where there were families, and really importantly, we employed photo documentary as well as narrative interviews and, and walking, landscape walks and things like this. But Linda's going to talk about this much more. And also, what I really want to emphasize is that we drew on a community participatory approach to identify and co-produce pragmatic solutions to chemical-based risks faced by the cocoa growing communities, as well as more traditional academic outputs. From my perspective, this wouldn't be ethical to do this work unless it was actually working with the local communities to think about what solutions are possible within these contexts of constraint. Now, next slide. I had some stuff on findings, which I'm not going to have time to go through, and Linda's really going to cover them. But just to note that doctors were interviewed and talked about the health, this one's saying the health situation in the region is precarious. Everyone is constantly sick. Next slide, please. There's a pragmatism involved. Doctors say, the one at the bottom, you cannot tell them to stop fumigating. You can advise them to take a rest. Some days you work on that, the other week on other things, so you recover. It's not feasible to say, stop doing this. This is people's livelihoods. Next slide. And also, it's not about informing people of the risks. People are often well aware. It's about understanding, what is meaningful to them, and the context of constraint in which perhaps people cannot undertake protective actions. And so there's stuff coming through around that as well. Next slide, please. And when we're talking about an ecological approach, what is really interesting is the importance of the environment, the importance, for example, of the breeze. The bottom quote here says, this farmer teaches his son more than anything to be careful of the breeze, that if the breeze was in his favour, to turn around so the poison would go the other way. This is about relationships and about how harm and care is spatially formed through relationship, as well as Kyaw mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. And the context of criminalisation can make it very difficult for people to be open about these harms or to seek help. Next slide. So really what we're wanting to do and what we have done through publication so far is to understand what chemicals are being used in these processes, but then also, you know, the social and ecological relations in which harm and care are also capacitated. And we're not interested in just generating what has been framed as data of damage, but to understanding how protection and, you know, in the context in which care can be capacitated. And there are lots of challenges to this. There's been challenges to conducting the fieldwork, which is, we're amazingly grateful to Linda Camillo and the others for carrying out. And I'm going to pass over to Linda, who's going to show us a bit more about what we found. Thank you.
Thank you, Magdalena, and hello, everyone. Well, today I'm going to talk about what we were able to learn in the field about toxic exposure in coca production and its link to drug policy. The argument I'm going to present to you is a preliminary result of the analysis we are carrying out. The photos accompanying the slides were taken in the field by two researchers from the Colombian team, Gustavo Pozo and Diego Lagos. I'm going to go through the slides a bit quickly so I don't exceed my time, but they are available in the expo section of the event platform in case anyone wants to take a closer look. Next, please. The fieldwork, as Magdalena said, was carried in a village located in the department of Putumayo in the southwest of Colombia, very close to the border with Ecuador. This is a village inhabited by peasants, most of whom have crops of 3 hectares or less. They cultivate the bushes, harvest, and process the leaf to sell coca paste. This is their main livelihood, and currently no legal economic alternatives are in sight. Next, please. What we would like to show here is that the routine operations of the war on drugs in Putumayo have pushed coca growers to adopt practices that worsen their exposure to toxic and health harm on a daily basis. We argue that the prolonged exposure to chemicals is not the result of unconsciousness or careless behavior, but the product of political decisions and institutional designs that, with the threats of crop destruction, burning of laboratories, or imprisonment, push coca growers to a greater health risk. So this contradicts discourses that portray coca grower peasants as lazy, ignorant people who look for quick and easy money and thus deliberately put themselves and their families at risk. This is an idea that has been used to stigmatize coca farmers and blame them for any misfortune, accident, or health affliction resulting from their work. Next slide, please. So coca production in Putumayo is mainly organized around family labor in small farms. This is a woman harvesting her own family coca crop. Next, please. Here we have the coca production cycle. In this region, it lasts 2 to 3 months, and it involves the maintenance of the crop, the harvest, and the transformation into coca paste. We conducted interviews, in-depth interviews, and ethnographic observations of all of these activities. And we found one widespread use of agrochemical pesticides considered highly hazardous. They can cause poisoning and even death if ingested, inhaled, or absorbed through the skin. And they can also have long-term effects causing cancer or nervous system disorders. The transformation of coca leaves into coca paste involves the use of gasoline, sulfuric acid, caustic soda, and others that Magdalena mentioned. And this can cause serious burns, skin problems, and respiratory disease. Next, please. So let's take a closer look first at why and how agrochemicals are used by peasants in coca crops. Fertilizers are used to produce more coca leaf in less time, and pesticides, or poison as they call it, are used to clean up the weeds that grow around the coca bushes to get rid of the pests that attack the crop. Next, please. In this slide, you can see photos of the two more common insects that peasants use pesticides for. On the left, you can see a kind of hairy caterpillar, and on the right, a looper caterpillar. They eat the leaf and thus directly reduce the peasant's income. This is a very humid weather. It rains for the most part of the year, and they say rain really worsens the water problem. Coca growers in Putumayo see the use of agrochemicals as imperative. They say if they didn't fertilize and control pests, the crops wouldn't be viable. Next, please. For some, including some state officials we interviewed, the widespread use of agrochemicals is symptomatic of a culture of easiness, but the fact is that there is a logic behind the use of agrochemicals that cannot be disconnected from the ecologies and conditions of existence in the borderlands. Next, please. So how does drug policy fit into this? Coca growers are increasing and diversifying the use of fertilizers, trying to win the race against eradication operations. This is a quote from one of them saying that they are now using a new hormone fertilizer to make the bush grow fast before the eradication forces arrive, so they can harvest at least once before the bush is destroyed. Farmers try to increase the productivity of their crops by the means available to them to partially compensate for the losses caused by eradications. Something similar happens with pesticides. Coca economy is full of uncertainty, especially in the face of state eradication policies, so they can't afford to stop spraying and have the worm eat whatever is left of their crops. We can now begin to understand why peasants use agrochemicals in the first place. It has to do with the ecosystems in which they are located, with the way the coca economy works in terms of profits, and with the pressures that counter-narcotic operations have on their income. So here, ecology meets drug policy effects to shape the peasant's decision regarding agrochemical use in Putumayo. Next, please. But now we would like to move from why to how. Pedro in the photo is one of the coca growers we worked with. He used to have a large 43 hectares farm. The coca crops were located close to the road and to his house. But one day, years ago, he sold almost all of it and he kept only 1 hectare that surrounds his house. And with the money he bought small plots of land, half or a hectare or less, in the farms of neighbors in that and another village. Next, please. Manual eradications and glyphosate spraying have pushed growers to split up their crops into small plots here and there, rather than having one big one. These fragmentations allow them to protect their income. As one grower told us, if you have a small coca crop and they come and pull it out, you are left with nothing. But if you have several, and even more if you have one here, one there, if they tear this one away, you keep the other 2. Next, please. This fragmentation of crops causes farmers to spend more days of the month spraying, and this increases the grower's exposure time to potentially toxic chemicals. This is exactly what happens to Pedro. He spends up to 15 days in a row spraying his several plots that do not even total 3 hectares because they are too far apart. If they were closer, he could apply the agrochemicals in a couple of days, but since they are scattered, he spends much more time. Eradication also decreases the income of the peasants or makes them lose the investment done in the crop, which pushes them to combine work on their own crops with paid work, normally doing the same tasks, planting, fumigating, harvesting, and transforming the leaf into coca paste in order to pay off debts and secure their income. This increases the grower's exposure time to potentially toxic chemicals, which in turn increases the risk of intoxication, accidents, or long-term health effects. In addition, when working on other people's crops, farmers have less control over the process and working conditions. Next, please. Now, in the transformation part of the process, we found something similar. Next slide, please. Next. Thank you. This is a quote from one of the growers, where he says his freedom is at risk, mostly when he is processing, because if the police, find him doing it, they could take him away for prosecution. Next, please. This constant fear that the anti-narcotic agents might find them processing the leaves leads them to adopt more risky behaviors and ways of working. I've listed some of them here. For example, often the farmers process at night with insufficient lighting to avoid being seen or found. They also work in a hurry, which means less precautions, the use of stronger, faster working chemicals, and more direct work techniques. Difficulties obtaining chemicals in the clandestine market or in transporting them may mean they have to be produced or transformed in situ by the farmers themselves. And also police checkpoints where coca-related chemicals are confiscated or peasants prosecuted lead to chemicals hidden in the same bags as food. Next, please. So this persecution, which has driven state policy on illicit drug for decades, is now embodied and internalized in daily production practices that demand speed and secrecy at the expense of protection and care. And this is one way the war on drugs has shaped toxic exposure in illicit drug economies in the Colombian borderlands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda and Magdalena. I can't see that there's any questions coming through the chat right now. So I think in that case, we'll continue with our schedule and then create some time at the end. Yeah, no questions as yet. We'll create some time at the end for some questions and comment or discussion. So thank you both for reflecting on our work in Colombia and the chemical harms embroiled in coca cultivation. We're now going to move to Myanmar, and we're going to hear a little bit from our survey work initially, and then move on to some qualitative findings as well. And as I said here, the focus is more on how drug use links with various kinds of health harm. So first off, I'm going to introduce Bayard Roberts from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, who's going to talk to us about the quantification of health effects linked to the study there in Myanmar. Bayard.
Great, thanks very much, Tim, and welcome everyone to the sort of Myanmar part of the presentation. So as Tim said, we're going to focus a bit more on the some of the survey work that we've been doing in Myanmar, and also some of the qualitative work that Tim will speak to. So the survey work, my colleague Khine will be speaking about that from the Asia Harm Reduction Network. But before we discuss the survey work, I'm just going to say spend a few minutes talking about a sort of foundational systematic review that we have conducted. So if we could have the slides, please. Thanks very much. Next slide, please. Thank you. So yeah, as I said, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about systematic review findings, and then we'll move on to Khine to talk about the survey, and then we'll have just a few words about the next steps for some of the survey work in Myanmar. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the systematic review was one that we conducted with colleagues like Lucy Platt and also Khine, which is really to examine the evidence around the determinants of health amongst people who use drugs in the 3 study countries of Afghanistan, Colombia, and Myanmar. Next slide, please. So the premise of this was really that the relationship between armed conflict and the health of people using drugs is surprisingly poorly understood. So we sought to examine the evidence to try and investigate and understand the health outcomes and associated factors, including armed conflict and its consequences, such as forced migration, among people using drugs in the 3 study countries. So fundamentally, what we wanted to know was evidence around the health outcomes of people using drugs in the study countries. What are some of the risk and protective factors for these health outcomes? And also, what are some of the broader contextual factors influencing health outcomes? Next slide, please. So we used a classic systematic review methodology for this, using these leading bibliographic health databases, using 3 search fields. The first was around the country terms, the second around terms related to drug use, and the third related to a range of health outcomes, and these were combined in the search. And we then did descriptive analysis of the data that came out, And we also did a quality appraisal of the evidence, and we followed standard PRISMA reporting guidelines. Next slide, please. So overall, we didn't find a lot of evidence out there. So of all the studies that we trawled through, we only found 11 eligible studies from Myanmar, 15 from Afghanistan, and 9 from Colombia. In terms of the characteristics of the study sample in the eligible studies, there are high numbers of migrants included in the study. So the majority of studies from Afghanistan were with migrant populations, both living abroad and also internally, and it was similar, particularly internal migrants in Myanmar. However, Colombia was a bit of an outlier in this, in that there were no studies that reported on migrant status from Colombia, which is surprising, particularly given the extremely high numbers of internally displaced persons in Colombia. In terms of drug use patterns, the studies were mostly around heroin injection, methamphetamine use, particularly in Myanmar, or cocaine or cocaine-based derivatives, again, particularly in Colombia. Next slide, please. So, importantly, almost all of the studies were exclusively among men. I think there was only one study that focused on women. Other characteristics of the study populations were low income, low levels of literacy, and high experience of imprisonment. In terms of the health outcomes, for HIV prevalence, it was high amongst people using drugs in Myanmar, 15 to 20%, extremely high. It was lower in Colombia and Afghanistan, but importantly to note, in all three countries, much higher than national prevalence levels. Similarly for hepatitis C, HCV, very high levels in Myanmar, particularly, and also Afghanistan, a bit lower in Colombia, again, much higher than than is reported in general populations in the three study countries. These are perhaps sort of predictable findings on health outcomes. What we observed was also gaps in evidence base, and particularly the fact that there are almost no studies looking at other health outcomes, most notably mental health, but also exposure to violence, particularly amongst women using drugs. Next slide, please. There's also, in terms of other factors influencing drug use, there was some evidence around geographic variation in Myanmar. There's a higher HIV prevalence in rural locations, and some of that was linked to occupation as farmer. In Afghanistan, there's a higher HIV prevalence in Herat in Western Afghanistan, and this was attributed to proximity to drug trafficking routes and high mobility, including refugee flows. Other determinants of health outcomes included armed conflict. So there's a strong evidence between armed conflict and needle and syringe sharing, and also sexually transmitted infection, STI symptoms. But there was no evidence of effect on HIV incidence or use of harm reduction programs. And finally, predictably, strong evidence of incarceration in Afghanistan as a predictor of both hepatitis C and HIV and injecting drugs. Next slide, please. Other key determinants were internal migration in Myanmar, which is associated with risky sexual behaviours amongst women, amphetamine users, and external migration in Afghanistan as a predictor of injecting drugs, and also reduced access to needle syringe exchange programs. And there was some evidence around ethnicity. Next slide, please. So to conclude on some of the key findings from the systematic review, really key gaps in almost any evidence on key outcomes such as mental health, but also exposure to violence, and also patterns of drug use, particularly around amphetamine use. Absolute dearth of evidence around research amongst women using drugs, less evidence in rural areas and the role of drug production. Again, not a huge amount of evidence we were able to find around actually the influence of armed conflict, both direct and indirect, such as through forced displacement. And generally in Colombia, a lack of evidence around some of the social structural determinants of health outcomes amongst drug users, most notably amongst internally displaced persons there. So the recommendations from our review are to address some of the critical research gaps, particularly increasing research with women using drugs, and also health outcomes related to mental health and exposure to violence, and then more policy and programming recommendations around the predictable need to scale up harm reduction services, including in rural areas, addressing amphetamine use, and the needs of sex workers, including amphetamine use, and then access to treatment for HIV and hepatitis C. So that was a whirlwind tour of our systematic review. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Khine, who is going to present on the survey work that we've been doing with the Asia Harm Reduction Network in Myanmar. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, Khine.
Thank you, Bayard. So I'm now going to present the cross-sectional survey findings. We did a cross-sectional survey in Wyoming, Myanmar in 2021, and this is the AHRN and LSHDM collaborated activity. Next slide, please. So I will start by getting into the background situations of drug use and infectious disease burden among drug users in Myanmar. Myanmar has a population of more than 53.3 million, and approximately 93,000 people were injecting drug users, which is 0.27% of total population between the age of 15 to 64 years. Kachin State is a home for 1.68 million people, and of them, 21,000 were injecting drug users. According to the last IBBS report, it is a 1% of Kachin population. And when we look at the same important characteristics of IBBS sample, half of the survey participants were more than 30 years old, and most of them were male, and hearing was the most common drug used in that population. In HRN, we did some internal assessment, and we found that 67.4% of our clients were poly drug users, and 3.4% were ADS mono users. Here, poly drug users mean they use both opioid substance and ADS. Next slide, please. This slide shows HIV and HCV burden among drug users in Myanmar. Myanmar is one of the countries with concentrated HIV epidemic, when HIV prevalence is concentrated among the key population, while general population has prevalence less than 1. In Myanmar, according to the IBBS survey, HIV prevalence in PWID was 35%, while general population has HIV prevalence of 0.59%. And our survey site, Wyoming Township, had high HIV prevalence of 56%. HCV positivity is also high in drug users in Myanmar, 56% nationally, and it is 84.5% in Wyoming Township. Drug treatment, which is the treatment to modify, stop, or reduce drug use, vary across IBBS survey sites, and it was 0.4% in Wyoming and 49% in Vermont. Next slide, please. So here is the aim and objective of the study. We aim to examine the social determinants of health and drug-related harms among people who use drugs. And the specific objectives, we have 3. We intended to measure health status and risk behavior of drug users, an association between social determinants and health status. And we wanted to measure the structural factors and their relationship with health status, and access to services, drawing on cross-sectional survey and routine service data. Next slide, please. We made some changes in survey implementation from community-based ideas. Community-based ideas was canceled due to military coup and insecurity, and it was replaced with convenient sample of clients at Asian clinic. Practically, we recruited available clients who came to clinic and received the services. It made the recruitment strategy simpler and reduced tension of the community. We could avoid the need for people to gather in a survey location for the purpose of research solely. Next slide. Methodology. We had eligible criteria, people who are 14 or older than 14 presented to the service, and they have used drugs in the last 3 months, either heroin or amphetamine at least once, and those who would like to complete a questionnaire and capable of giving consent. Individuals use structural questionnaire on a tablet which contain health and drug use behaviors, violence, treatment, displacement, livelihood, stigma, and mental health. HIV and HCV data were linked to the Asia and Khine data with the consent, and testing was provided if not previously recorded or had a recent HIV or HCV negative results. The clients received 5,000 Myanmar check, which is approximately $3 reimbursement upon completion of the survey. Our target sample was 400. Before the interview, informed consent was obtained and the ethical clearance was sought from IRB and LSHDM, and implementation changes was reviewed by the project advisory group and approved. Next slide, please. We performed descriptive statistics of key social demographic characteristics and prevalence of health outcomes such as HIV, HCV, mental health, physical and emotional violence. Then regression analysis was done to assess the effect of migration on mental health outcome and physical or emotional violence outcome. Migration in our study include not being born in Myanmar, experience of economic migration, and experience of forced displacement as a result of conflict. Next slide. We recruited a total of 46 clients, and median age was 30. Majority of them were male. We only have 13 female in our sample, and 85.2% used heroin as main drugs in the last 3 months. Over 1/4 of the clients were migrated from outside Myanmar township, and 3/4, which is 77.9%, had ever migrated for work, and 19.5% have ever migrated because of war or the armed conflict. Next slide. 61% had an exposure to the emotional violence in the last 12 months, and 9.2% has recent exposure to the physical violence. When we see the average stigma score, it is higher within families than that related to the healthcare providers, and we'll see its association with the outcome or interest in the regression model. HIV prevalence was 64.4%, and HCV prevalence was 78.65%, which is in line with IBBS report, and it is also in line with the data presented by Bayard in the systematic review. I thought all participants had symptoms of anxiety or depression, which is 32.8%. Next slide. So here is the table to illustrate the results of 3 regression models to look at the effect of migration on symptoms of anxiety or depression. The first column shows 3 models we developed. Second column shows the adjusted odds ratio, where an odds ratio of greater than 1 suggests an increased risk or association with that exposure, and less than 1 decreased risk. The third column shows the 95% confidence interval, and the last column shows p-value. Those who have ever been migrated because of war or armed conflict had higher odds of having symptoms of anxiety or depression. And in addition to that, we found some associated factors. Main income from farming was a protected factor, and higher average stigma score within families, being called in derogatory term, and being hunger in the last 12 months were associated with increased risks of symptoms of anxiety or depression. Next slide. We have another table in this slide having the same format, and this table shows 3 models to explore the effect of migration, the adjusted odds ratio, and corresponding confidence interval and p-value for associated factors of outcome of recent exposure to physical or emotional violence. Those who have ever been migrated because of war and conflict is again associated with this outcome. Recent exposure to physical or emotional violence. And in addition to that, those who have ever injected drugs and having symptoms of anxiety or depression had higher odds of recent exposure to physical or emotional violence. Then, higher average stigma score within families was also an associated factor. In this outcome, in this regression analysis, being on methadone was a protective factor. All these regression models, we included the primary confounders mentioned under the table as a footnote. Next slide. Summary and recommendation. A third of participants have symptoms of depression, and more than half of the participants have recent exposure to physical or emotional violence, which highlights the need to address vital health needs of PWD beyond blood-borne diseases. Widespread experience of poverty evidence. 30.1% were in unstable housing. 27.7% had experienced hunger due to insufficient money for food. And these are linked to symptoms of depression or anxiety or physical or emotional abuse. Stigma was more widespread within families than healthcare setting, possibly due to the simple recruitment at a harm reduction service with staff sensitized to drug use, but does reflect widespread stigma on the drug use in society. There is a clear link between displacement due to conflict and poor health. Methadone use linked to reduced reports of physical and emotional violence in the study, and it adds to existing evidence showing positive effects of opioid substitution therapy on health of people who inject drugs or people who use drugs. Next slide, please. In our sample, a small number of female drug users were included and needs to focus future research on needs of women who use drugs. We will do detailed analysis of Asian routine service data, examine drug use pattern, HIV incidence over time, geographical variations, and we plan to do mathematical modeling, and we'll do disseminations of survey findings to the relevant stakeholders. Next slide. And thank you so much. This is the end of my presentation.
Feel free to make comments or ask questions in the chat. I'm going to give 10 minutes or so reflecting on some of the qualitative findings from the work we've been doing in Myanmar, which we've been doing in collaboration with the Asian Harm Reduction Network, of which Khine is part, along with Murdo Beale, who I think is online with us as well. Next slide, please. And the next one, yeah, great. So there's a whole bunch of themes which we're following through qualitative interview accounts with people who inject drugs in Myanmar, in both Waimo and Bamo. Today I'm going to focus on issues of livelihood and drug treatment, and I'm going to say something about how these two things interact together to create a very precarious situation, both a precarious situation in relation to livelihood as it relates to drugs, but also drug treatment. Next slide, please. This is just to say something of how we went about doing it. We had intended to have a kind of deeper, more sustained, even slightly ethnographic approach to doing our qualitative work. But a couple of global or big events interrupted those plans. First and foremost, the COVID-19 pandemic, and also the military coup in Myanmar, as Khine mentioned. So we kind of altered our approach. So our qualitative study turned into less of an ethnographic sustained approach and more of a rapid situational one. We trained up a number of interviewers linked to the Asian Harm Reduction Network through a 5-day training to undertake interviews with a topic guide on our behalf. That slide summarizes some of the kind of key issues there. Our focus in terms of the study participants are people over 18 who have current or very recent last 3 months history or experience of drug injecting. And most people in this setting, as Khine has already said, are injecting heroin, although some are also injecting methamphetamines, using methamphetamines. Next slide, please. That's our sample. So we're focusing on 2 areas, Waimo and Bamo. We have interviewed around 33 people who inject drugs, as well as 1 person who has since stopped. I mention that because we're going to draw on his account in a minute. Almost all of these people are male. Only 5 people in our sample were women. And this is an issue, as Khine mentioned, in terms of future work going forwards. It's not that women who use drugs do not exist. It's that they very rarely or less often come into contact with services, and including research studies. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do now in the time I have available is tell a little bit of a story, if you like, about how precarious lives intersect with precarious treatments. I'm going to focus mainly on methadone substitution treatment, although there are other forms of treatment which are obviously in play in this setting. As many of you would know, opioid substitution treatment is an essential medicine and treatment in relation to addiction and drug use, as well as helping to prevent HIV and other bloodborne infections. It was introduced in Myanmar around 2006, with at that time, I think, around 206 people who were in treatment. And now you're looking at over 20,000, 25,000 people that are in some way involved in methadone maintenance treatment in Myanmar. So let's start with this extract. I'm going to read some of it for you. This actually is from a person who's 22 years old. He's a farmer. He's stopped using drugs, actually. This is the one person in the study who is a former user. He hasn't used drugs for 6 months. He started using when he was about 15. And he says he's ended his addiction. And he talks about some of the reasons for that change. And I think perhaps if you could just read through the extract. But what he does is he folds in his self-desire for recovery inside a story about how drugs and addiction affects his family. He says his older brother, for instance, died from drugs, and he also fell victim to drugs as well. And this has prompted him to keep thinking and thinking on how he might kind of move away from drug use. He's tired of himself, he's tired of his situation, and eventually he does in fact give up. I put that out there to start with just because it infuses ideas of self-recovery with notions of family, but also a sense of shame. He does refer to the people around him looking down on him for being a drug user, for instance. Next slide, please. So the first theme is precarious livelihoods. And I want to just draw on 2 cases to make this point in terms of the precarity of livelihood amongst people we interviewed in this situation. The first story, which relates to the first extract here, is a woman of 36 years old, and she's from Barmo. And she gives a sense of the everyday juggle, if you like. She works on the land to plant the paddy fields, but they now throw the seeds. So they no longer hire people to plant them. And she finds it really, really difficult to get work. As a consequence, she seeks out small tasks on the farm and really anything that's going, any kind of daily wage labor which she can find. She notes that she can't really work until she's used a drug, so she sees her drugs as somehow productive in relation to work. She also talks to us about her family and how other family members have got touched by addiction. She notes that her husband recently died, for instance. Her 4 young children are living with her and her eldest child with her grandmother. Providing for herself and her children, she basically describes as a real everyday struggle. And like many in our study, she locates her own self-desire for addiction and recovery inside her notions and sense of family and the household, as we can see here in this extract. The second example, which is the second extract on the slide, is quite similar. He, again, is juggling through day to day, trying to make money and earn on a daily basis where he can. His work involves loading up trucks with the branches of bananas, which he does with 20 other workers. He's been living on the banana plantation now for 3 years. He says he gets about 5,000 around $3 a day for this. But sometimes this doesn't happen. The bananas aren't ripe or the trucks don't turn up. He also says that 5 to 10 trucks have to be loaded, which takes some days before he'd be paid, and sometimes they are not. And on those jobless days, basically he is borrowing for money to get by. He also talks to us about his family. He says that his child is sick and he can't afford the medicines and he has to borrow for these medicines. On jobless days, like our first case, he seeks out vegetables for sale, things like spinach or fireweeds, other things. He also works as a mechanic. He also gets involved in selling firewood. He does what he can in the village. He'll take whatever daily wage or daily job that he can. And as his extract shows us, he also locates his self-desire for addiction inside issues of livelihood at the level of the household or family. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to set the scene with those two cases to kind of illustrate just what a juggle the daily grind is of making money to get by, and that one's sense of self-desire for addiction recovery is some way located, it seems, in these accounts in a narrative around the household and as a unit of livelihood. A couple of other comments on precarious livelihoods before we move on to treatment. The first on this slide is that work environments are both enabling and disabling in their drug work relationships. Many people use drugs, for instance, to incentivize and to get through arduous work in difficult conditions, as the first extract illustrates here. Another key theme coming through, which paints something of this backdrop of precarity in relation to livelihood, is a narrowing work opportunity. There's many accounts which talk about work becoming harder to get. And this is also linked both to the pandemic situation as well as the political situation, as we see here on this slide. So what we have here is a story of a narrowing work opportunity and the jobs being available being those most risky or most dangerous, at least as far as it concerns people who inject drugs who are trying to find work. Next slide, please. At the same time as narrowing work opportunity, many accounts talk to a theme of increasing drug availability post-military coup. This is linked in some accounts to there being less arrests around, and some people, as this person here, talks about drugs having become cheaper as a result. This isn't always the case, and there are also accounts which say the opposite, particularly post-pandemic, where villages have kind of shut down or locked down and strangers can't go in and drugs have become less accessible and in consequence to those people more expensive. So what we have here as our backdrop before we start talking about treatment are very precarious livelihoods in a drug work relationship, which is both enabling as well as disabling, and narrowing income opportunity coinciding with increased drug availability and in some situations more expensive drugs. Next slide, please. So let's talk about drug treatment in this context and how that intersects with these precarious livelihoods. There's three main forms of drug treatment we spoke to people about. The first is self-detoxification, or kind of do-it-yourself approaches, which are with or without medication. The second set of drug treatment technologies, if you like, or interventions, which we talked about, were faith-based, largely residential rehabs, but also theological kind of educational camps. And the third type is opioid substitution treatment, which is our main focus today. Next slide, please. But one general point I want to make is how these three forms of drug treatment effort entangle with broader narratives around addiction and its treatment in this setting. A general theme is this idea of a return to normality, a corrected self, if you like, in search for a normalcy. The idea of treatment as a means to being like a normal person or to becoming a better person in some way. Now, these accounts of addiction as a kind of form of self-correction or as a form of self-improvement are not new. We see and we hear them elsewhere, but they are significant here in terms of how they fold into ideas of addiction as a form of social shame, and addiction as a kind of as a self-recovery, which also is in search of some kind of social acceptance in the family, in the village, and beyond. The two cases on this slide, I'll just talk to one of them because of time, gives an indication of how self-recovery and drug treatment intersects with this idea of a self-change in search of a social acceptance, which also locates the household and the family as really, really important in that. this extract here, she's referring here to something her mother said, actually, which kind of reproduces the sense of social shame she links with her addiction, which she talks about elsewhere in her account. So this is just one incident of a bigger picture. She says, her mother says to her, look at your sons are ashamed of you. You were looked down upon by others, even by the relatives, and so on. So there's a sense of social shame, which is linked to addiction, which this self-recovery is seeking to solve in some way. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh yeah, great, thank you. So do-it-yourself treatment or self-detoxification is a very prominent example of this self-change narrative, which locates addiction as a problem of the self, that the self has to sort out, that the self becomes responsible for sorting. And in a way, therefore, the self becomes responsible for kind of sorting through its social material situation, including working itself through a sense of shame and family failure, and disruption at the household level, and that kind of thing. So the extracts on this slide illustrate this in terms of people locating addiction as a problem of the self that they have to solve through self-determination, through having a tenacity of will, doing it alone without the support of others, and so on. Next slide, please. So let's end by saying a few words about methadone substitution treatment in this setting and how that intersects with precarious livelihoods. The first thing is a very common theme, and we hear this elsewhere around opioid substitution treatments, is the promise they afford in terms of gaining this sense of normalcy. The idea that I can live, I can work as a kind of normal person through opioid substitution treatment. So this is a relative freedom which methadone substitution treatment is providing from addiction. It's not like a freedom from addiction in the sense that an abstinence is, as might be imagined of faith-based treatments common in this setting. It's more of a generous constraint, a way of living day to day with addiction in the background, whilst also functioning for the family and through work. And these extracts give a sense of this. And as the last extract on this slide shows, families come to understand this too. They understand because I'm in charge of the work. And so it said here, I work together with my parents. It's good for the family and it's good for ourselves. My family is happy with it and the financial situation is fine. Consequently, next slide, please. There are, though, in this setting, differences of view, and including among families and in communities more generally about methadone treatment. And part of the problem here is that methadone is a generous constraint, that it doesn't provide a kind of promise of total freedom from addiction, as other kind of drug treatment interventions apparently do or are imagined to do. So here the idea that the substitution isn't enough because it isn't a quitting. It's not a quitting of drugs. There's a sense also that many families, we are told, have this idea that opioid substitution treatment or methadone treatment could be a quick fix, that it doesn't take too long for people to get through and have solved or have recovered their addictions. And over time, therefore, there's a waning of support in families for people's ongoing kind of attachment to methadone treatment. And secondly, the idea, again, coming back to livelihood and households, is work. That methadone takes work itself. In some ways, it's like a job. On a daily supervised schedule, you have to turn up every day, and this can interfere with work. And in a setting where there is a narrowing of work opportunity, one has to be very flexible. One has to be on hand. You have to be available. And as this extract shows here, the family might say, for instance, well, if gold is to be found, you need to be there. And methadone treatment, in some ways, is not so much a getting by as a getting in the way. Next slide, please. Now, all of this, the Asian Harm Reduction Network and others that are delivering harm reduction and linking people into methadone substitution treatment are finding ways of working through. A big challenge in this setting, there's many of them, but a big challenge in this setting is accessibility. It's just navigating the geography. in terms of connecting people up to treatment. And this is no mean feat. And we've got many examples of the hard work that's involved in getting to treatment that can take many hours, 2-3 hours, for instance. It might involve the crossing of rivers, as well as other things. So getting to the clinic is not in itself that easy. Getting registered into methadone, again, comes with certain problems, particularly for migrants who are undocumented, and so on. So the services that are available do their best to kind of navigate that situation and to create practical adaptations by helping people with the ferry, providing auto rickshaws to pick people up, for instance, helping with documentation, and so on. But some of this is made more complicated post-pandemic, where gatherings aren't available, some villages have closed down, also post-coup, roadblocks, other things. So the challenge of actually getting people to clinics and sustaining them there has been really, really difficult. As I said earlier, methadone is like a job, and for some people can take the best part of a whole day to get there. Now, the way the services tend to work in this setting is that people are going on a daily basis for their methadone pickups, at least for the first month or so, and then there is the possibility of takeaway doses. And this is what I want to emphasize as part of this talk. 1 minute, thanks, Bayard. Is the innovation of takeaway doses is just so critical in this setting. So what's happened post-pandemic is the National AIDS Programme has supported the idea of extending takeaway doses from a week to more, from 2 weeks, and in some cases more, as these extracts show on this slide. The provision of takeaway doses is described as a good thing to come out of bad things. So it's an innovation which has been prompted by a pandemic. A good thing to come out of bad things, to me, typifies this idea of generous constraint. So relative freedom, a bounded agency. As people say, there's no challenge now in getting methadone. It's not difficult to access methadone. They gave me 13 days worth. Now today they start giving 27 days, apparently. This is due to COVID-19. And as one of the service providers tells us, this is good not only for health, but it's good for livelihood. It's good for keeping people in jobs. For those people with jobs, as well as those who don't have jobs, the transportation issue is solved. They only have to come every 2 weeks. Next slide, please. But there are problems which are yet to be fully resolved, although they have now since the study, I should say, which also relate to this situation of precarity made worse in the context of a pandemic and a post-coup situation. And this is the closure of the programs to new clients because of the political situation. Now, there's a bunch of stuff probably going on there in terms of problems with kind of human resources and person power, given people not coming into work, civil disobedience, as well as travel restrictions related to kind of COVID-19 and so on. But this emerges as a key issue in our study around the precarious situation of treatment. We do see, however, methadone being informally acquired and shared amongst people in a kind of do-it-yourself approach to getting by, both in terms of the management of withdrawals and enabling people to carry on at work in the meantime while they can't get into treatment programs. But as one of the service providers says, this at the time was quite an issue because people are without as much income as they had because jobs have become harder. It's daily wage labor especially has been harder to come by, and in some cases drugs have become a little bit more difficult to get, as well as a little bit more costly to buy. So again, we see various factors coming together here to create a precarious situation. Last slide in conclusion. I've probably gone on far too long. These are my concluding points, I think, is that we have a situation here of very precarious livelihoods, which are entangling with treatments which are precarious in and of themselves. We also see that precarity, both in terms of livelihood as well as treatment, is compounded recently by the political situation as well as pandemic. Some of that's obviously been overcome, and some of those things are obviously temporary. We see that addiction is often narrated in this setting as a kind of form of self-improvement, but in search of a social repair or a social restoration, if you like. And in that narration, we see that the family and the household is terribly important, both in terms of its social kind of meaning, but also in terms of its material capacity in relation to livelihoods. So I'm going to end there, and I hope that's given you some flavour of some of our qualitative work.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Tim and Khine. But before we go into the question, I just want to extend my sort of gratitude and thanks to all of the partners involved in the data collection in Colombia and Myanmar, both extremely hard contexts, and especially given everything that's happened in Myanmar. I think the work by the Asia Harm Reduction Network in collecting that data is quite remarkable. So thank you all to all our presenters. Rather than me sort of mangling and trying to summarize some of the key messages now, I'm going to go straight into the questions. We've got a few questions, and I shall share those. Apologies to those of you who asked the questions that I don't know your names, but I will try and repeat as many of the questions as we can in the 8 minutes that we have remaining. So, and if I could ask the presenters to give answers to the questions, so we can cover as much as possible. So the first question, which is directed to Linda and Magdalena, how you spoke about the harms are partly a response or a reaction to the eradication policy, which is included logic and the necessity of people adopting the practices that they do. I was wondering whether, or the person is asking whether you can comment on the strategies for using your findings to support harm reduction amongst the cocoa producers in Colombia, and to oppose some of the eradication policies that are causing some of these harms to them. Linda, maybe I could ask you to comment on that first.
Thank you, Bayard. Well, we're going to talk about this tomorrow at the policy engagement workshop. But just to say that we have sought to support harm reduction by encouraging community workshop and by producing and distributing sort of occupational health guide with some of the farmers. This has been done with some of the local harm reduction strategies that we found in the field, and we have collaborated with them with producing this. And also, I think that highlighting these social and political relations behind chemical use and generating evidence about how the pressure of eradications and criminalization are one of the main reasons the chemical risk is so high, we can have an impact on public discourses and avoid them to use these stigmatizing ideas about growers as careless to support and justify violent and coercive measures to reduce illicit crops.
Thanks, Linda. Magdalena, anything to add to Linda's response?
No, I mean that was great. Linda's really the expert on this, since she's been on the ground working with the communities. But I guess it's that sense of working with community to understand what it is that they need, and perhaps even that process can help community feel a bit more empowered and create this as more of an issue that's put on the table and discussed. So, you know, hopefully in this way, then we can also think about, you know, and by community members sharing the things that they're doing to enable care, then we may be able to disseminate those and have them employed more broadly.
Thanks very much. So we have a question around COVID, and Tim touched on this. I'll bring you into this question as well, Tim. But also for Khine and Linda first, perhaps, is during the research that you did in both Colombia and Myanmar, did you generate any information on how the pandemic has affected drug-related harms and/or forms of self-protection or treatment? And Tim, you touched on this in your presentation, but perhaps Linda or Khine, you could perhaps respond to that. Linda first, perhaps.
Yeah.
Well, we didn't look very deeply into this, the pandemic effects, but something we saw is that masks and some protection elements have become more of a normal object in peasants' lives, so they are more at hand. But they are still kind of hard to use because of the climate conditions and the very heavy physical labor they do. But that's that's as much as I can say about the pandemic effects.
Sure, thank you. Khine, anything to add on that?
Yeah, in Myanmar's survey, we did not include like specific questions to assess the impact of pandemic on our drug users populations. We did not include that kind of questions, but pandemic did have effect on our survey. As I said in my presentations, the implementation plan changed, and then we had to follow all the infection control measures. So we kept the long distance among the clients waiting for the survey, and then we wear masks, all the interviewers and also the interviewees. So this kind of impact had affected our survey, but we did not ask like anything about the impact on their drug use and their life. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Khine. And Tim, you mentioned in your presentation about how the pandemic has narrowed opportunity for many people, but it has also led to some sort of positive adaptations in care, and gave the example of takeaway doses. Was there anything else that sort of came through in the qualitative work you and the team there did?
I think one of the important learnings is just how well the network of services have managed to maintain a service provision despite the interruption, despite the disruption, in fact. And if you look at I know this is not speaking to the qualitative data, but if you look at the kind of coverage indicators around opioid substitution treatment and takeaways, for instance, it's something around 70% of the 20,000 people that are in regular receipt of methadone in Myanmar that are now receiving it via takeaways.
Yeah.
Whereas prior to April of last year, it was around 20%. So I just think what comes across for me is just the immense work and ingenuity and adaptation and tinkering, if you like, that goes into making this stuff happen, both on behalf of the agency of people who inject drugs, but also the services themselves in navigating what is a very, very kind of disruptive situation.
Thanks very much, Tim. I think we've only got about 30 seconds left. There was a question for Khine, and in that 30 seconds, Khine, perhaps you could, there's a question around how are plans to disseminate the research findings in Myanmar changed as a result of the coup there, and in terms of changing stakeholders? Are there any kind of very brief key kind of responses you want to give to that question?
Yeah, Bayard. Yes, I agree that dissemination is like very important for the research and then also the study team. So we will discuss the dissemination plan within the study team, and we will do external necessary discussion with interim coordination mechanism and other international agency, donors, multilateral agency, WHO, and the UNAIDS for disseminations of this finding. And because like policy work is a bit clear at the moment, so we'll wait and see how the situations grows with the given context. And at the same time, we think local NGO can learn from this finding and they can apply this knowledge in their client-centered implementation. So yeah, we will have continuous discussion for disseminations of this finding internally and externally. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that very concise response, Khine. So I'm going to finish there. We're finished on time. We were actually ahead of schedule at one point, which is unheard of, I think, for this group. So we will now finish. I'm conscious I'm between everyone and their coffee break. So I just want to finish up by saying thank you to our panel here. Thank you to all the work that's gone into collecting the data presented here. And thank you to the audience for joining us. We do have further sessions tomorrow around dissemination and policy impacts. I would encourage people to join us in those sessions as well. But thank you all. Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you. Please do join us for the next session after the break.